Senna Valeworth had no idea that the man she was about to beg for a favor could smell the lie she'd been rehearsing for the last 40 minutes. She also didn't know that by the end of the night, her entire life would belong to a bargain she never meant to make. The throne room of the Ashenmore Keep was not a place where commoners made requests. It was a place where treaties were signed in blood oaths and wars were ended with a single word from the man who sat at its center. And yet, here she was, in a borrowed dress that pinched at her ribs and shoes she couldn't afford to scuff, standing before the Alpha King of the Northern Territories like she had any right to breathe his air. Caelum Drakemere watched her from the obsidian throne with the kind of stillness that made lesser wolves drop to their knees. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, dark hair swept back from a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who wanted to make a point about unfairness. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, pale gray rimmed with something almost silver, and they hadn't blinked once since she'd walked in. Senna's heart was hammering so hard, she was sure every wolf in the room could hear it. There were 6 of them. Guards, advisors, all watching her like she was a field mouse who had wandered into a den of apex predators and somehow hadn't noticed. She curtsied. It was terrible. Her knee wobbled and her hand grabbed at the side of her skirt like it might save her from toppling. "Your Majesty," she began, and her voice cracked on the second word. One of the advisors, a tall woman with silver braids, pressed her lips together in what might have been second-hand embarrassment. Caelum said nothing. He just watched. Waiting. Senna had practiced this speech 17 times in the mirror of her rented room above the tanner's shop. She'd had it memorized. Every word polished and perfect. But standing here, under the weight of those impossible eyes, every rehearsed line evaporated like mist off a lake. So she told the truth. "I need a date to my ex's wedding." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the torches flickering in their iron brackets. Somewhere behind her, one of the guards shifted his weight. Caelum's expression didn't change, not even a flicker. "Repeat that." "My former betrothed," Senna said, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "Aldrich Fenworth. He's marrying the daughter of House Calloway in 9 days. The entire Western Court will be there. Every noble family from here to the sea." She swallowed. "And he sent me an invitation." "Why?" It wasn't really a question. It was a command to explain, delivered in a voice so low it vibrated in her sternum. "Because he wants me to see it," she said, and something hot and bitter climbed up the back of her throat. "He wants me to walk in alone. He wants everyone to see what he traded up from." A muscle in Caelum's jaw tightened. It was the first movement he'd made since she started talking. Senna pressed on before her courage failed. "I can't go alone. I won't give him that. But I don't have anyone to go with. My family's name is ruined. My friends chose his side in the split. And I can't just bring anyone, because the entire Western Court knows my face and they'll tear apart whoever walks in with me unless he's someone they wouldn't dare touch. And you think that someone is me." "I know it's insane," she said quickly. "I know I have no right to ask. But I served in your mother's household for 3 years before she passed. I was her seamstress. She was kind to me, and I thought maybe, if there was any debt of goodwill left from that service, I could ask for this one thing, just one evening. You don't even have to dance." Something shifted in Caelum's gaze. At the mention of his mother, the storm in his eyes quieted for a fraction of a second, replaced by something older, something that ached. Then he leaned forward. Just slightly. Just enough to make the air in the room compress. "You want me to pretend to be your companion for an evening?" he said. "To make your former betrothed jealous?" "Not jealous, just—" She searched for the word. "Silent. I want him to stop pitying me. I want them all to stop looking at me like I'm something broken that got left behind." Before we continue, please take 2 seconds to like this video. It tells me you want more stories like this. Caelum studied her for a long moment, His gaze traveled over her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Down to her clenched fists. Back up to the defiance she was barely holding together behind her eyes. Then, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories did something no one in that throne room expected. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just been handed exactly what he wanted. "I won't go as your date, Senna Valeworth." Her stomach dropped. Of course. Of course it was too much to ask. She opened her mouth to apologize, to back away, to salvage whatever shred of dignity she had left. "I'll go as your husband." The word hit her like a wall of ice water. What?" Caelum stood. He was enormous. She'd known that intellectually, but watching him rise from the throne, all 6.5 feet of coiled power and broad shoulders, and the kind of presence that rewrote the gravity in a room, knowing became something else entirely. Something that made her knees feel unreliable. "I have my own reasons," he said, descending the steps with a measured, unhurried stride. "The Western Court has been pushing for an alliance marriage for months. Lord Calloway in particular has been relentless in his attempts to wed his youngest daughter to me. If I arrive already claimed, the matter is settled." "You want to use me as a shield?" Senna said slowly. "I want to use you as a wife." He stopped 3 steps above her, and even with the height difference of the stairs, they were nearly eye to eye. This close, she could see the faint scar that ran along his left temple. Could smell pine and wood smoke, and something darker. Something that made the animal part of her brain sit up and pay acute attention. Temporarily, publicly, convincingly. "That's insane." "You came to the Alpha King's throne room in a borrowed dress to ask him to be your +1 to a wedding. Insanity is apparently the theme of the evening." Senna's mouth opened, closed. He had a point, and she hated him for it. 9 days, she said carefully. "That's all?" 9 days of preparation. The wedding, the reception. And then we part ways with a quiet annulment that neither court will question. He tilted his head, studying her. "Unless you'd prefer to walk into that hall alone." The image flashed through her mind. The gilded ballroom of Calloway Manor. Aldrich at the altar with his new bride, all golden hair and perfect teeth, and that smug, satisfied expression he wore when he knew he'd won. And Senna in the back, alone, invisible, exactly what he expected her to be. "Fine," she said. "Fine, I'll do it. Then we begin tonight." Caelum turned to the silver-haired advisor. "Miriel, have the amber suite prepared. My wife will need appropriate lodging." Senna flinched at the word. Wife. It sounded different when he said it. Heavier. Like it meant something he wasn't telling her. Muriel's eyebrows rose approximately 1 millimeter, which for a woman of her composure was the equivalent of screaming. "Of course, Your Majesty." "I have conditions," Senna said quickly, because if she didn't set boundaries now, she'd be swept away entirely. "No one touches me without my permission. No one gives me orders. And when this is over, I walk away free and clear. No debts. No obligations." Caelum looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Agreed. I have one condition of my own." "What?" "You don't flinch when I'm near you. A wife who recoils from her husband tells a story we don't want told." Senna lifted her chin. "I don't flinch." "You flinched when I said the word wife." Her cheeks burned. That was surprise, not fear. The ghost of a smile crossed his face again, softer this time. Good. The 9 days that followed rewrote everything Senna thought she knew about the Alpha King. The first 3 days were logistics. Miriel, who turned out to be both Caelum's chief advisor and the most terrifyingly efficient woman Senna had ever met, orchestrated a complete transformation. Gowns were commissioned from the keep's seamstress. A ring appeared, a simple band of hammered silver with a single sapphire that Caelum placed on her finger himself, his hand steady, his touch so careful it made her breath catch. "It was my mother's," he said, not looking at her as he slid it into place. "She would have wanted it worn by someone with spine." Senna stared at the ring, at his hand still holding hers. His fingers were warm and rough with calluses, and she suddenly couldn't remember what she'd been about to say. They practiced. How to stand together. How to move through a room as a unit. Caelum walked her through the political landscape of the Western court with the precision of a military strategist, pointing out every alliance, every grudge, every pressure point she might need to know. "Lord Calloway will test you," he said on the fourth evening, as they walked the keep's torchlit corridors side by side. "He'll be pleasant to your face and vicious in the margins. Don't react to the barbs. Just smile and hold my arm." "I've survived worse than a rich man's snide comments." "I know." He said it quietly, and something in his tone made her look up at him. His profile was sharp against the firelight, jaw set, eyes forward. "I read the court records from your betrothal dissolution, what Aldrich did to your family's reputation, what he said about you publicly." Senna's steps faltered. "You researched me." "I research everyone who enters my throne room." A pause. "What he said was a lie, Senna. Every word. The way he said her name, low and deliberate, like he was learning the shape of it, like it mattered." She didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded and kept walking, painfully aware of the warmth radiating from his arm beside hers. By the sixth day, something had shifted between them. The rehearsed proximity had begun to feel natural. She caught herself leaning into him without thinking, and he caught himself adjusting his stride to match hers without being asked. On the seventh night, she found him alone in the keep's library, reading by a single candle. His shirt was unlaced at the throat, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he looked so unexpectedly human that she stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before he spoke without looking up. "You can come in, Senna. I don't bite unless provoked." She sat across from him, pulling her knees up in the oversized armchair. "Can't sleep." "Nervous about the wedding?" "Nervous about seeing him. Nervous about whether this whole ridiculous plan is going to fall apart the second he looks at me, and I forget how to be anyone other than the girl he threw away." Caelum closed his book, set it down, looked at her with those winter storm eyes that had become, against every rational instinct she possessed, the safest place she knew. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" Her throat tightened. "Probably a disaster in a borrowed dress who barged into your throne room with the worst favor anyone's ever asked. I see a woman who walked into the most dangerous room in the Northern Territories without an army, without a title, without a single ally, and asked the most powerful man in the realm for help. Not because she was weak, because she was brave enough to refuse to be small." The silence between them was a living thing, warm and trembling and full. "Caelum," she whispered, and she didn't even know what she was going to say next. Just that his name felt like something important in her mouth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "When we walk into that wedding, you will not be the girl he threw away. You will be the woman who became a queen, and every person in that room will know it." She should have looked away. She should have laughed it off, or made some deflecting comment about how they were only pretending. But she couldn't, because his eyes were serious and his voice was rough, and something inside her chest was cracking open like ice in spring. "Thank you," she said, barely above a breath. He reached across the space between them and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were trembling. The Alpha King's fingers were trembling. "You should sleep," he murmured. "We leave at dawn." Neither of them slept. The wedding of Aldrich Fenworth and Lyessa Calloway was exactly the spectacle Senna had expected. Callaway Manor blazed with 1,000 candles. The gardens were sculpted to impossible perfection, and every noble family within 300 miles had dressed in their most ridiculous finery to witness the union of two of the wealthiest houses in the Western Court. Senna stood in the entrance hall in a gown of midnight blue silk that Muriel had chosen with military precision, the kind of dress that didn't shout for attention but commanded it absolutely. The silver ring glinted on her finger. Her hair was swept up, exposing the line of her neck, and she was fairly certain she was going to be sick. Then Caelum appeared at her side. He was wearing black from collar to boots, the only ornamentation a silver clasp at his throat bearing the Drakemere seal. He looked like a weapon someone had dressed in formal wear. He offered his arm. "Ready?" "No." "Perfect, let's go." They walked in together and the room stopped. It wasn't subtle. Conversations died mid-sentence. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the ballroom tracked them as they moved through the doorway, and Senna could feel the shock rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped in water. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Here, at a minor Western court wedding, with a woman on his arm who was wearing his mother's ring, Aldrich saw them first. He was standing near the head table, golden and handsome and exactly as smug as she remembered, and she watched the color drain from his face in real time. His new bride, a pretty girl with copper hair who looked about 19, tugged his sleeve in confusion. Lord Callaway, a barrel-chested man with shrewd eyes and a politician's smile, recovered fastest. He strode forward with his arms open. "Your Majesty, what an unexpected honor." "Lord Callaway." Caelum's voice was pleasant and absolutely terrifying. "I believe you know my wife." "My wife." 2 words, delivered with the casual certainty of a man stating that the sky was blue. Senna felt them land in the room like a thunderclap. Callaway's smile froze. His eyes darted to Senna, to the ring, back to Caelum. "Your wife? Lady Valeworth?" "Lady Drakemere," Caelum corrected, and the possessiveness in his tone was not performed. Senna could feel it vibrating through the arm she held, low and fierce and genuine in a way that made her pulse skip. They took their seats. The whispers were a constant tide around them, but Caelum moved through the crowd with the unshakable calm of a man who had never once in his life cared what anyone thought of him, and somehow, touching him, his steadiness became hers. The ceremony was beautiful. Senna watched Aldrich exchange vows with his new bride and waited for the pain. For the crack in her chest, the sting of tears, the hollow ache of not enough. It never came. Instead, she was aware of Caelum's thigh pressed against hers on the narrow bench, his hand resting on her knee beneath the table, warm through the silk of her gown. The way he leaned down during the readings to murmur observations that were so dry and precise that she had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. He's sweating through his ceremonial coat. "Stop it," she whispered, her shoulders shaking. The bride's father looks like he's calculating the tax implications in real time. Caelum. The efficient mispronounced eternal bond as internal bond, which, given the families involved, might be more accurate. She pressed her face into his shoulder to muffle the laugh, and his arm came around her, and for a moment, she forgot it was pretend. The reception was where the trouble started. Aldrich found her alone on the terrace while Caelum was inside, trapped in a conversation with 3 lords who wanted to discuss a trade dispute. She'd stepped out for air, and suddenly there he was, golden hair catching the lamplight, that familiar smile that used to make her feel chosen and now just made her feel tired. Senna. He said her name like he was tasting it. The Alpha King. Really. "Hello, Aldrich. Lovely ceremony. Your bride seems sweet. Don't deflect." He moved closer, and there was something ugly beneath the charm, the same thing that had always been there, the thing she'd spent 2 years pretending she couldn't see. "What game are you playing? You and I both know a man like Caelum Drakemere doesn't marry a seamstress." The words landed exactly where he intended them, right in the soft, unhealed place that still whispered he was right, that she wasn't enough, that this was all a performance, and everyone could see through it. "You don't know anything about my marriage," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was proud of that. "I know you." Aldrich's smile sharpened. "I know you're playing dress-up, Senna. I know that ring on your finger is borrowed, just like everything else you've ever had. And when he gets tired of whatever this is, you'll be right back where I left you. Alone. That's enough." The voice came from the doorway, low, controlled, and carrying the kind of quiet fury that made the air pressure change. Caelum stepped onto the terrace, and in the lamplight, his eyes were no longer the color of a winter storm. They were the color of ice before it breaks. Pale, lethal, absolutely still. Aldrich straightened. To his credit, or perhaps his stupidity, he didn't step back. "Your Majesty, I was just congratulating your wife." "No." Caelum crossed the terrace in 3 strides, and he didn't stop until he was standing between Senna and her former betrothed, a wall of controlled power in a black coat. "You were reminding her of the version of herself you tried to create. The small one. The grateful one. The one who was supposed to be flattered you chose her at all." Aldrich's smile vanished. "Here is what you need to understand, Fenworth." Caelum's voice didn't rise. It dropped. It became something so quiet that Aldrich had to lean in to hear it, and leaning in meant looking up, and looking up meant understanding, viscerally, exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of the world. "Senna is not performing. She is not pretending. She is the woman who walked into my throne room and spoke to me as an equal when men with armies at their back can barely meet my eyes. You didn't trade up from her. You revealed that you were never worthy of her to begin with." Senna's vision blurred. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "If you speak to her again tonight," Caelum continued, still in that terrible, quiet voice, "I will consider it a personal insult. And I don't think you want to know how I handle personal insults. Do we understand each other?" Aldrich left. He didn't walk. He retreated, and every scrap of golden polished confidence went with him. Caelum turned to her. The ice in his eyes melted the instant they found her face, replaced by something raw and worried and painfully tender. "Are you all right?" She meant to say yes. She meant to be strong and composed and unaffected, the way she'd trained herself to be through 3 years of surviving alone. Instead, she stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, and his arms came around her like they'd been waiting, and she felt the breath leave him in a long, shuddering exhale, like he'd been holding it since the moment he heard Aldrich's voice. "It wasn't pretend," she said into the fabric of his coat. "What you said. Was it?" His hand came up to cradle the back of her head. His fingers slid into her hair, gentle and shaking. "It hasn't been pretend for me since the 4th day, Senna." She pulled back just enough to look up at him. His eyes were bright, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen from the man the world called the most dangerous wolf in the realm. "I don't want the annulment," she whispered. "Thank the gods," he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was the release of 9 days of restraint, of careful distance, of touching her arm and wanting her waist, of watching her laugh and wanting to taste the sound. His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones, and she rose onto her toes and pulled him closer by the collar, and for one incandescent moment, the entire Western court and every political calculation and every carefully constructed plan dissolved into nothing but warmth and pressure, and the sound of his heart hammering against hers. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "For the record," he murmured, You were never the girl he threw away. No. You were the woman I found. 3 months later, the Amber Suite had been redecorated. Not by Muriel's orders, though the advisor had opinions about everything. Senna had done it herself, slowly, piece by piece, replacing the formal tapestries with softer fabrics, adding bookshelves, scattering cushions in the window seat where she liked to sew in the mornings. It no longer looked like a guest room. It looked like it belonged to someone who lived there. Because she did. The court had adjusted with surprising speed. A few raised eyebrows, a handful of snide comments from the kind of nobles who considered seamstresses a lesser species, and then the quiet, dawning realization that the Alpha King's wife was not a woman who could be dismissed. She sat in on council meetings. She asked sharp questions. She remembered every name and every grievance, and she had an uncanny ability to diffuse tensions with a well-timed observation that made Muriel press her lips together in what Senna now recognized as approval. Aldrich's marriage, according to the gossip that filtered through the court, was already strained. Senna felt nothing about this except a vague, distant hope that the girl with the copper hair would be all right. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Senna sat in the window seat of the library, her legs draped across Caelum's lap while he read, and she stitched a pattern of silver stars into a piece of dark blue linen. "You're making that face," she said without looking up. "What face?" "The face where you're pretending to read but actually watching me." A pause. "I don't know what you're talking about." She looked up. He was absolutely watching her. Book open in one hand, completely forgotten. Those gray eyes, soft and warm and crinkled at the corners in the way that still made her chest ache. "Come here," he said. "I'm working." "Come here, wife." The word didn't make her flinch anymore. It made her glow. She set down her sewing and crawled across the cushions until she was tucked against his side. His arm heavy and warm around her shoulders, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow beneath his jaw. "I was thinking," he said, pressing his lips to her hair. "Dangerous. I was thinking about the night you walked into my throne room. In the borrowed dress. In the borrowed dress, with the terrible curtsy." She pinched his side and he laughed, a real, full laugh that she'd learned was rarer than gold and more valuable. "My curtsy was fine. Your curtsy was an act of war. I've seen enemy combatants approach with more grace." She laughed against his neck, and his arms tightened around her, and the fire crackled, and outside the library windows, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall over the northern territories. "Caelum? Thank you for being my date to the wedding." He tilted her chin up with one finger and kissed her, slow and warm and tasting of the spiced tea they'd been sharing, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that looked a lot like forever. "Anytime," he murmured against her lips. "Though for the record, I was never your date." "No? I was always your husband. You just hadn't agreed to it yet." She kissed him again, because he was right, and because the snow was falling, and because the girl who had walked into a throne room with nothing had somehow walked out with everything. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people hear these stories.